Welcome to the Grace Cafe. My name is Mark Rae. I'm your host for today, and I have a very special guest, longtime friend. He probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to do a little introduction anyway, because there's maybe a lot about Dr. Anderson that you may not know. He is a pastor, teacher, speaker, author, church planter, in his past life a business entrepreneur and a Bible salesman. He is a seminary founder, professor, and what many people don't know, he is a Kermit the Frog impersonator. Dr. Anderson, it is a pleasure to have you here on the Grace Cafe with us today. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I was going to bring my wife, that's Miss Piggy, but she's otherwise tied up at the moment.
Some of my favorite sermons when I was working with you. Let me launch right into this. You have had an incredibly varied career in ministry. Yes, you've had a business career, but your ministry career has spanned a tremendous number of different jobs, number of different responsibilities. Let me break this down into the church side and then the seminary side. And let me just ask you, what were you most passionate about? What did you love doing about church work when you were a pastor for so many years?
Well, I still love it. I still get to do it. But the thing I enjoyed the most was finding 2, 3, 4 lay people, men or women, who had a hunger for the scriptures, and then teaching them how to go deeper. And in doing so, their eyes lit up as to the depth of God's word, and they usually wound up with a passion that transcended the class and kept going. In fact, one guy I just had breakfast with the other day. I taught him this in, I think, 94, but he's kept going. He starts at 5 in the morning, goes for 2 hours, then he takes a walk with his wife, has breakfast, and goes to work. And he's been doing that all these years. I've never had anyone else like that. But anyway, just to see the hunger. I think I probably have done that with 300 people in 40 years.
Wow.
And a high percentage of them, I think over a third, have gone on into full-time work. Not because of any doctrinal content I taught them. It was just they saw how exciting the scriptures were, wanted to know more, and felt God's pull on them to go on to seminary and then serve full-time.
We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that because I have a question or two related to that. But yeah. Let me fast forward to the founding of the seminary and your multiple roles in the seminary. What jazzes you about being founder, president, as it relates to the seminary?
Well, it's more than one thing, but just right off the top, going into a new country, establishing the work there, and then seeing the excitement, the gratitude, the thrill, and the passion that these students in these countries have when they begin to understand that God's love is something they can't earn and something they can't lose. And they just want to spread the word. People start lining up. Down in Cuba, we made our presence known, and 400 people showed up that wanted to go to our school. But we couldn't take that many. We started with, I think it was 40, 42, something like that. But now, over the years, we are up to 120 down in Cuba. And there's a good chance to change that nation if you get 120 trained pastors. And
sure.
And we'll have more. We're just kind of getting rolling there. Well, that's extremely exciting because that's, what the Great Commission is. It doesn't say come, it says go. And so rather than having students come to us here in Houston, we're going to them. We're in over 40 countries now and teaching in, I think, 7 different languages.
So do you find it? Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's a big thrill. And then that course I taught to lay people through the years, I now teach as an exegetical course here at the school. So I get the same thrill with them that I did when I was in the church.
Do you find internationally that there is a greater hunger than there is here domestically, or do you find pockets? Tell me what you're seeing when you go internationally versus what you see here locally.
Well, what you don't hear too much about is the great hunger that's out there internationally. Over here in America, we hear that this is a post-Christian nation. You think of Europe, and Christianity is just almost, not a conversation piece even. But those are the only two pockets that are like that. You get into Indonesia, China, Korea, all that world. Then you get down into Africa, South America. Just, I think 30 years ago, Brazil was 10% evangelical. Today, they're 40% evangelical. And they just elected an evangelical president. And part of that's a reaction to Marxism and what it's done to devastate the schools system and the effect it's had on their children. It used to be illegal to homeschool in Brazil. Now, turned the whole operation over to a couple connected with our school. And they'll have an influence on that nation. Well, that's extremely exciting.
Are there other nations that you're thinking, boy, if we could just crack that, we could potentially change a culture, change a nation? Are there other nations on the horizon?
Well, yeah. Just this past summer, I went down to New Zealand and spoke, and they have a group there that's been studying for a couple of years, landed on what they believed, got on the internet to see if anyone else believed it, found us, flew here to Houston for them, and said, this is what we want in New Zealand. So when I went down there, every church I went to, they turned it into a conference, not just a church service, which you actually had to pay money. Well, these aren't big churches. New Zealand's a small country, 4.5 million. But every church was packed with waiting lists. Well, that's a hunger I haven't seen in America since the 70s for the scriptures. They're not going to be entertained. They're not going because the church has the best band or best singers or best skits or any of those things. They're truly hungry for what the scriptures say. Well, we can affect that nation, I think, that way.
So let me now back up to your specific class. You affectionately called it the Kamikaze class. Having been a participant in it, it's a 6-month deep dive, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is. And I warned. Well, you remember back in church, I warned those people: don't start this if you're not going to finish, because it's difficult enough that pretty much everyone who starts it wants to quit, at least halfway through. But the class doesn't. The climax is not in the middle; it's at the end. Everything builds toward the end product. And I haven't had anyone who finishes the class that regrets taking it.
So back me up for just a minute, because one of the things that attracted me to that, you said at the very outset of that God's not a God of chaos; He's a God of order. Therefore, there's an orderly thread to a book. Now, I've been through seminary training. I've been through a lot of the historical, grammatical, all of the different seminary training that you get for Bible study method. This was brand new. This was something completely different. The whole synthesis analysis. But there was a key thought that spans every verse from start to finish. Where did you learn this from? How did this become? It really is a transformative style of study, because you grasp a book so quickly and you hold on to it. You don't lose the grasp of that book. Talk a little bit about the history of that class, and you said over 300 people have taken it. Share with us a little bit about the process behind that class.
You mean how I learned it?
Yeah.
What you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, and not only how you learned it, but how what's the process? What do you actually do with it?
Well, I learned it from a professor when I was going to seminary, and he would give us a little assignments on, say, 1 Timothy 2:15, which says, "She shall be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith, love, etc." So he says, all right, hand in a 3x5 card with what you think that means. So we'd all run off to the library, read 10 commentaries, pick the one we thought made the most sense, hand it in, and his answer was always better. And so after the class, 3 of us went up to him and said, could you teach us how you do that? So he said yes, and he took a summer and taught us. And that's the best thing I got in seminary, and I didn't get it in seminary. It meant so much to me that I just started taking, like I started with 2 guys in my youth group. I was a youth pastor and taught to them. And then my first church, the 300 people are comprised of little groups of 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 is the biggest group I ever did it with. But the essence of it is really what E.D. Hirsch talks about in his book, Validity and Interpretation. And you learn to validate by invalidating. Kind of like people come to believe in the resurrection. Did the disciples steal the body? Well, that doesn't make sense for these reasons. Was he in a swoon? The swoon theory. Well, that doesn't make sense for these reasons. Were the disciples lying? Well, that doesn't make sense. They all died for a lie. So you eliminate all the possibilities, and what you have left is the answer. And in that case, he rose. That's the answer. Well, you do that with exegesis as well.
Yeah.
You take a guess. That's what he calls a heuristic genre. You take a guess as to what you think it means. Then you bombard the guess with research of the details. If the details don't agree with your guess was wrong, so you guess again. It's the same thing that happened with when Bill Cosby's son was killed over in Bel Air, I think it was, over there in Los Angeles. And they made a guess. They guessed it was a robbery. Well, they bombarded the guess with the evidence, fingerprints, what was taken, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they had no fingerprints on file. Nothing was taken. So they finally said, back to the drawing board. We were wrong. It's not a robbery. Maybe it's this. So they kept doing that until they found a paradigm where all the evidence matched up and they found the perpetrator. Well, that's a little bit what we do with Bible study. You guess it means this. Bombard the guess by looking up words in the concordance and the dictionaries, writing your own commentary. And you keep doing that methodically throughout the whole book of synthesis, analysis, synthesis, analysis, synthesis, until you have the thread, or what Hirsch calls the intrinsic genre, that ties the whole book together. Once you have that, you can relate every verse in the book to that thread. And the reason you don't get this in seminary is the commentaries just don't do that. The commentaries are great at analysis, fabulous at analysis. One friend of mine spent 15 years writing on the book of Ephesians. There weren't many stones left unturned when he done that. So we use the commentaries, but it's the last step. And you'll find if you use them, they're not good at synthesis. They don't try to put it back together. They can tear it apart. They don't put it back together. And that's 5 minutes of
yeah.
What it's about.
But I will tell you, one of the things that astounded me about you in specific was you not only had the biblical knowledge, but you had the logic of attaching those and really being able to bring those. And there's a gift. There's an art to that, really reconstructing that once you have all those facts. Yes, you can do it. There aren't a lot of people that can do it at the level that you can do it at.
Well, I appreciate that, but I would say it's more of a skill. It's like learning to play the piano. It took me 2 books before I thought I had some idea of what I was doing. So it's I suppose if someone is more gifted at literary things and all that, perhaps he would be better at this. But it's something anyone can do. Just a matter.
So let me shift your attention here. Speaking of Kamikaze, let me attach Kamikaze to the book of James. You've written a book, Triumph Through Trials. Am I right in assuming that the title would be your consideration of the main theme, that intrinsic statement about the book, Triumph Through Trials?
Most definitely.
And from that, you obviously get James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. It's an interesting thing. And you note in your book, consider all joy when, not if, not you might, but when. Can you speak just a moment to the whole issue of when you encounter various trials, we as believers, seminary students, pastors, are any of us immune from those trials?
Well, yes and no. There are all sorts of different trials.
Sure.
We'll call it different categories of suffering. You have deserved suffering. If I go out here on the road that's designed for 45 miles an hour and I drive 105 and have a wreck and I'm in the hospital, I'm suffering. Well, you call that deserved suffering. We understand that. The harder is the undeserved suffering, which also falls into two categories. You have the suffering of the innocent. Maybe in my car I'm speeding in, I've got a 3-year-old child and they're killed in the wreck. Well, that child did nothing to bring that
right.
demise upon himself. So that'd be innocent suffering. And then you also have what is more rare, what's out there, is the suffering for being righteous. The missionaries in Mosul, where they cut off the heads of their children, ISIS cut off the heads of their children. That probably wouldn't have happened were they not missionaries in Mosul. Mm-hmm. So there's a case where people are suffering precisely because they're being righteous.
Right.
Well, James is interesting. As opposed to 1 Peter, James picks up all our suffering, both the deserved and the undeserved, put them all under the heading of a trial or trials, and say that we can find benefit in all of them. And part of what he talks about is endurance. And he basically says, without endurance, you'll never become a mature Christian. You won't be around the Christian life long enough to develop the kind of agape love that is selfless instead of selfish. You won't be around long enough to develop the kind of faith that moves mountains. You won't be around long enough to have the kind of hope that fixes on the world to come instead of spending our lives chasing what's in this world. And a lot of that's Christian maturity, but you can make a case that the most needed virtue in the Christian life is endurance. You can make a case for that. Okay. Because without it, there are all sorts of passages, Romans 5, Hebrews 12, etc., that tell us to keep running the race, and that the author and finisher of our faith is the one that's going to perfect us, all to bring more glory to God. So it's like quitting a marathon. You wasted a lot of time and energy and missed the goal.
Would you speak just a moment, because one of the things in your book that struck me, and actually I've preached this and taught it, it's the definition of the word patience, which fits into this whole concept of endurance, that there is to define patience the way you define it as remaining under. Talk for a minute just about what that means within the scope of a trial to remain under, the patience that's developed. Can you speak to that for just a minute?
Yeah, you're kind of using the wrong word there.
Okay.
Although the King James says patience, it's hupomone, is to remain under. That's the word endurance. Okay. The word patience is macrothumia. When you get to the fruit of the Spirit, macrothumia is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and that's patience. When you get to the end of the book of James, in chapter 5, he says, consider the patience of Job, the macrothumia. That word means long-tempered. Macro, in English, is a big molecule, macromolecule. Sure. But in Greek, it meant long. And then thumos was the word from which they got heat or thermos, and that meant rage. So it's kind of being long-tempered is patience. Now we're going back to your question deals with remaining under, so that's endurance. So I would define that as staying under the protective umbrella of God's will for your life.
Okay.
For example, in 1 Thessalonians 4, he says, this is the will of God for you. So it's kind of getting real clear. I'm going to spell it out. This is the will of God for you.
Yeah, here it is.
Even your sanctification, that you might learn how to acquire your life partner in sanctification and honor, not in the lust and, I love the old King James word, concupiscence, as is the Gentile way. And so he presents Satan's way to find a life partner and God's way to find a life partner. They're inverse, and it's a fascinating passage. But if you step out of God's will there and follow the lust pattern, you may find yourself divorced 20 years later, if not less than that. So if you stay in God's will, that's the protective umbrella. Stay under there. You are protected, I think, from the hail. And that's not Texan for hell. That's hail from heaven upon you, darts of the devil, etc. That can assail you if you try to go it your own way, your own will.
You are you're very transparent in Triumph Through Trials, and you shared with me a number of years ago after the death of your oldest son, Jimmy, that you really felt the need to preach through this book, that the lessons in this book were the necessity of you to actually not only dive into it, but actually preach it and share what God had taught you out of this book from the trial of what you had gone through. In having done that, how did God enter into that trial with you, and what did you learn about who God is in the midst of something as difficult as the death of your son?
Well, preaching is an interesting animal. I never set out to be a preacher, wound up there. But in doing it, I found that what I preach are essentially messages from God to me. And then I just let people listen. So that may be a pretty self-centered approach. It's kind of like every message is really for me. So as I preach through James, I'm preaching to myself.
Right.
That I need to remain stay under the umbrella, et cetera. Experientially, though, I'd seen other tragedies as a pastor, and I'd seen the bubble that God puts his children into to kind of console them and give them hope, et cetera. So I was kind of halfway expecting that, and that came. What I wasn't expecting is that it never left. It's more like Ruth Paxton's book, Life on a Higher Plane. It's like he took my wife and me to lots of ways to describe it, a deeper level, deeper intimacy with him and each other, by the way. Just a deeper walk with him. And as Luke 14 talks about Discipleship Road, it talks about counting the costs, lest you start to build a tower and then you get it half built and quit. Well, if you do endure and don't quit and get the tower built, you also have a refuge place. You have a vantage point on the world, high up as you look out, and you see the broad horizon. You see what God's doing in the big picture a little better. And there's that brings a lot of hope. I remember some friends took me out to lunch about 6 months afterward, said, "How you doing?" I said, "Well, I think I'm doing okay." They said, "No, this is us. You can tell us. How are you really doing?" I said, "Well, I think I'm okay. You see, I have a retreat center." I said, "This is a terrible analogy, but when I come to the scriptures, I see another world, almost like looking into a crystal ball. And in that other world, things start to come together. And you begin to get just a little glimpse of Romans 8:18, which says, I don't consider the sufferings of this world worthy to be compared to what shall be revealed in the sons of God." So somehow, though I haven't experienced it, what's coming in the next world is going to be like comparing a Pacific Ocean to a thimble full of water, or comparing Mount Everest to a grain of sand. That though we don't see it now, we'll be able to look back and say, wow, wow. I have a preacher friend I took to Israel, and everywhere he went, he said, wow. Sooner or later, the whole bus was just with him. We were just going, wow.
Yeah. Kind of felt that standing in the Garden of Gethsemane. I understood that feeling.
Yeah.
Let me make sure. I'm gonna ask you one or two more questions if you have a moment. But I'm also opening it up that if there are any questions from the audience who is listening in and watching right now, please feel free to send those, and we'll see if we can't get to some of those questions. When I first came on staff, you made a statement to me, and you've referenced it earlier about counting the cost. do you find that people moving into ministry, are they more susceptible to the trials than those who aren't? Is that a fair assessment? Because they're or do you see equally equal trials on both sides of the fence, that there's and then it's really up to whoever it is and how they respond to those?
Well, on average, you can say that Christians and non-Christians have the same trials. I mean, we all wind up dying. We all suffer through the pain of transitory relationships. Parents lose children, children lose parents, et cetera, et cetera. But this category of suffering for righteousness, because you're righteous, does kick in, I think, with the dedicated Christian. Now, when I say discipleship road, that doesn't mean full-time Christian service. That just means, as Hybels used to put it, a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ. And once you we'll say you cross that line of kind of Romans 12:1, where I'm presenting my body a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. I just had someone in Austin. I had lunch with him, and he wanted to come work at our school. He wanted to do that so badly, he was willing to raise his own support. I've only had one other person do that. But, hey, man, go for it. Well, he's into it, and he signed up for my Kamikaze class. And I was excited to have him because he's a good student. He already knew Hebrew and Greek. Well, the very first week, I find he has to drop out. And he's not the kind of guy to drop out. So what's wrong? He said he just lost his job. I don't find that any coincidence. I don't find that coincidental at all. He was about to step into training that would take him deeper, and you'll find you can't lead anyone deeper than you are. So he was going to go deeper and full time, and whammo, the devil attacks. I've seen that 100 times. So those I would call specialized trials from the devil himself, an attack. And I think it's just like when you're on the sidelines, the opposing general doesn't care about you, but if you get on the front lines, there's going to be some fire coming your way.
So you're going to be the plenary speaker for our Strong at the Broken Places conference, February 23rd. You're going to be teaching on James 1 through 4.
What's that date again? Let me see if I have that on my calendar. Oh, no, I do. I'm sorry.
So here's my wife's question for you. Does your staff know that you are the preeminent jokester, prankster? This is not uncommon for you. Yes, you are speaking February 23rd. Yeah.
Good.
February 23rd, you are the opening speaker, speaking on James 1 through 4, and sharing really from your heart just about your own personal experiences, the depth of where James goes with this as the opening salvo to triumph through trials. Is there anything you can kind of tip us off to as to what will be a part of that message, kind of as a teaser for people to sign up and become a part of registering for the conference?
Well, I liken
no pressure on you here. No pressure.
I liken the Christian experience to entering a university where you want to major in, let's say, math. And they make you take a lot of courses like history and philosophy and English that you have no interest in. But they tell you to be a well-rounded student, you need these courses. And since we're a university, we want you to be a well-rounded student. So if you're going to graduate, these are the courses you have to take. Well, I was fortunate to go to a university that was free for anyone who got in. That's kind of the way God does the Christian life. It's free for you. It's a free gift. Scholarships have been paid for by Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Jesus paid it all. But once you're in God's university, he's got some courses you're really going to enjoy. And he's got some electives Oh no, they're not electives. He has some electives you're going to enjoy, but some required courses you will not enjoy. But if you don't finish them, you don't graduate.
Yeah.
Now, graduating, we're not talking about going to heaven here. Just getting in the university puts you in heaven. But graduating, we're talking about the judgment seat of Christ, when he looks back at our lives and see what's going to glorify him and what isn't. So we kind of introduced the book that way. Those,
good.
As you said when we started, trials aren't optional for the Christian; they are inevitable. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll be filling lots of different breakout sessions, a number of different plenary speakers, all dealing with the issues of how does God enter into places where life breaks us, creates strength, creates beauty, creates joy that really could not have been created any other way but through that brokenness. So we're thrilled that you're going to be a part of it. I'd like to ask you, will you come back again on Grace Cafe, and maybe we can expand the conversation related to the seminary and what's happening and where you're going and what you're doing. We'd love to have you back again to be a part of that. If I could ask, I'm getting you on record here that you will come back. Is that okay?
Well, I remember Charles Ryrie's words to me one time. He was 90 years old. He was being invited to speak somewhere, and he said, "Look, I don't even buy green bananas anymore." So, so I don't know. It's
provided the Lord doesn't take you or he doesn't come back, will you come back?
Oh, yes. When couched that way,
Right.
I'd be happy to come back.
Great.
But by the
Dave,
way,
thanks for spending some time with us. Yeah.
One more word. I love Watchman Nee's
Sure.
illustration of the alabaster box. He says, until the box is broken, you can't smell the perfume. And that's kind of the way it is with us in Christ. The perfume's in there. But if we come with our crustedness and our self-reliance and our giftedness, it's very hard to smell the perfume. Sometimes we have to be broken. Yeah.
Great point. Great point. Thanks for putting that fine point to it. Dave, thanks for being a guest here on the Grace Cafe. For the rest of you who are here, we've got the conference coming up February 23rd. You can register at gsot.edu/conference. Next week, Catherine Barner will be interviewing Melissa Shaver. That will be occurring on Tuesday, February 5th. And they're going to dive into the whole issue of health and wellness. So we're going to be excited to welcome them and see what's going on. I do have one quick question for you as we conclude. How does a Christian balance living by grace in the church and not allowing apathy to creep in? Final question for you.
Well, I think it's two different questions. Kind of, you can be living by grace, and apathy can still creep in. I mean, living by grace is simply relying on the Lord and not doing things that are good in order to win his favor or his blessings, which is, of course, legalism instead of grace. But I think apathy comes in more when we just stop doing anything. That's why he told the Ephesian church in Revelation to go back to your first love, go back to your first works. You've lost your first love, and to get it back, go do the first works, the things you were doing when you were passionate on fire for Christ. So I think it's the same thing. I've found in my own life, when I'm unhappy, I'm usually serving myself somehow. Whatever I'm doing is about me. When I am joyous, it's usually because I'm serving others. And there's great joy in that. And Jesus himself, sermon on upper room, sermon in the upper room, what am I doing here? Upper room discourse.
Yeah.
After teaching them about washing feet or serving others, he says, happy are you if you do these things. And James 1 does the same thing.
Yep.
He says, pure religion undefiled is before God is this, to go visit a widow and an orphan in their distress. They can't do anything for you. Your motives can't get mixed up. It says you will be happy in your doing.
Yeah.
I'd say apathy, the antidote to apathy is action, you might say.
Great point. Great point. Thanks again. Appreciate you being with us. Always good to talk with you. And for you all there at Grace Cafe, thanks for being a part of this with us. We'll see you next Tuesday. Appreciate you being with us.